Welcome to SF Commercial Property Conversations with Bruce Bean, where Bay Area investments meet expert insights. Get ready to unlock the strategies of commercial real estate success.
So today we have Neal Collier on with us, and Neal has an interesting story about getting into real estate and then reworking sort of Spanish-style apartment buildings in the LA area. So Neal, it's great to have you on. I kind of would just love to hear your origin story of how you got into real estate, where you were born, and perhaps what job you did before you got into real estate.
Okay, well, I'll start off. I was born in Los Angeles. I'm a third generation Angelino. My grandmother was born here, so my daughter's now a fourth generation, so proud of that. The city's changed quite a lot since, I was growing up. But we have the values that we've had since I was younger and when things were a lot different. So very proud Angelino. I attended UCLA undergrad, USC grad for business, so I'm very native here. And after that, I worked in various industries such as retail as a buyer. Then I went back to business school, got my MBA in marketing, and then I worked in various packaged goods companies such as Hunt Wesson, and then ultimately I transitioned into the entertainment industry, as people are wont to do in this town. And I worked at Disney for about 14 years, and then after that, for Warner Brothers for another 5. Wow. During the time I was at Disney and Warner Brothers, that's when I was kind of keeping my feet in 2 different buckets as I started to build towards having more financial flexibility. I never believed in just, that I would be working forever for the same company. I always wanted to have some sort of financial security. So, and God forbid I was ever let go or fired, I'd be able to still support myself and my family. So that being said, it started when back in 1998, I bought a condo, just to live in. Prices were extremely low. Interest rates weren't, they're about where they are now, maybe even a little bit higher. But because prices were so low and, you could essentially put down very little money and use your PMI way of being able to get the max leverage, and, you paid a little bit more, but at the end of the day, compared to what I was paying in rent, I paid a little bit more in the mortgage. And so that got me thinking, it's good to learn the real estate math and being able to understand how to amortize and what that all means. So I lived there for 3 years. And then, as I started to get more familiar with the market and kind of driving around LA, different parts of LA, seeing how the market was evolving, finding new neighborhoods that were gentrifying, we came across a building in the area of the Carthay neighborhood of Los Angeles, which there's 3 different neighborhoods. They're all considered what are called HPOZs, or historic preservation overlay zones. 2 of which were already designated, 1 of which was not at that time. And that was the one that was not designated historic officially was Carthay Square. That's where we have one of our duplexes. That was our starting point. We found a duplex. It was priced right with, the proceeds from a contingent sale, which at the time people were doing contingent sales all the time. It was very easy. We were able to find a building that not only, allowed us to do a contingent purchase, but also came with oil rights, because at that time, people still held on to their oil rights. And during that particular market, it wasn't super hot yet, but it was enough where we could negotiate to have those oil rights transferred, which I still have to this day. Which is very unusual. You never find that anymore. You can separate that from the title of the property. So we bought the building. We didn't know anything about renovation, but I had lived in older buildings growing up, and I knew I had a little bit of a vision of what I wanted to achieve, and I was really attracted to a lot of the old charm, although there was a lot of original detail that was stripped out of the building in subsequent years since it was built. So we focused, and this kind of became our MO, we focused more on renovating the systems. So plumbing, electrical, if there was some cosmetic work that needed addressing, we dealt with that. But, we didn't have a lot of money think this is the only time I ever had to do this, but we had to borrow a little bit from my wife's parents so that we could we had to rebuild the bathroom. It was just the walls were floating. The termites had literally eaten all the wood, and it was just tile holding up the entire bathroom. So we had to demo that and rebuild it. But we still adhered to the mantra of keeping the original character. So we found subway tile, we found the liners, we found everything decorative that would match the exact design of the previous bathroom. And to this day, anybody who walks in there still can't tell that it was rebuilt. That was kind of what was the goal. Kitchen wise, we kept the kitchen the way it was. It was an original kitchen, but the problem with old kitchens, that's probably the one thing, unfortunately, I always have to redo. It's because they were never built to modern standards. Cabinets were built in areas where you needed the fridge to go. So you kind of had no choice, but we kind of left it that way for probably a good 10, 15 years. Because again, we had to prioritize how we were going to spend money. But the key to our success, I think, was taking advantage of financing during this time for probably a good 10 to 15 years. You were able to do a lot of things you just simply can't do today. You could get 80% loan to value loans on equity lines with no tax returns. You could do stated income. That's completely unheard of now, right? Took advantage of refinancing constantly because during that time, all we saw were interest rates continue to go down and down and down, and maybe level out and go down more. So we rode that wave as well as anybody did, and most people did who owned real estate during that time, obviously. But I was always looking. I think what that allowed me to do is unlock the equity in all my rental properties. So I would we owned the duplex after about a year and a half and getting tired of living with a tenant, which, at the time we had tenants that were just nuts. And I was working in the Valley. We looked, I'd never really been to Glendale. Ironically, being in LA at that time, most people just kind of stayed where they lived. You never really drove around very far. There was no need to, but we ended up buying in Glendale where we live now. And we, just basically rented out the other unit. The building was able to, cover all its operating costs. And we were able to pull equity out of our rental property to buy our house. So we had two mortgages. We had the equity line on the duplex and our house, but it could still work because the duplex was more than paying for itself and it was covering our mortgage. But my wife and I are very frugal. We bootstrapped like hell for 3 years. We didn't do anything but pay down that equity line. Literally, this is where sacrifice comes in. I grew up, my grandmother was born in the Great Depression, or she lived through it. She instilled those values in me. People who get into this business, who take a lot of risks and are free with their money, usually aren't very successful, at least to my knowledge. Granted, there's a lot of very well-capitalized individuals who have family money or whatever, but that's not who I was. So I had to be very cognizant of that. So we paid off everything. And then, again, another opportunity presented itself in building in Alhambra. Again, we had paid off all our equity line on the duplex, but we still had that equity line. But then we pulled an equity line out of our house because our house had appreciated in about 3 years since we owned it. And we were able to pull equity out of that and use that to put the deposit down on the new rental property, which is a 4-unit building in Alhambra. And so that was kind of the formula. We never used real money. We just used debt. And I basically created my own financial models to basically estimate what our rent would be, how that would balance out against all the, variable expenses that we would have, our mortgages, our property taxes, et cetera, and make sure that we would be getting into a building that, could essentially pay for itself right from the beginning. Fortunately, the one in Alhambra, we were able to get under contract despite having an offer that was literally $100,000 less than the other buyer who was interested, because the broker who was representing that building for sale mistook the fact that we wrote an offer for $1,100,000, not $1,100,000. They thought it was $1,100,000. Can you imagine? So
Wow.
when the sellers
Wow.
found out what happened, we were already under contract. They were
Oh, wow.
livid. But it was too late. It was too late because
Oh, wow.
and we weren't trying to deceive anyone. It's just we wanted to be over the $1 million limit, right? So anyway, you get lucky sometimes. But the main thing was, never, like, we didn't have any money. We didn't have really discretionary income. We just kept putting more, any discretionary income we had, we would just put right back into the property, renovate, right? So the only way to buy these buildings and to bring them up to, the right conditions is to have that money set aside for the renovations, but that's all we had. We didn't have money to buy and renovate. So that's where debt financing comes in. And it's actually still a principle I use today. I don't ever use, I think maybe a couple of the short-term rental condos, which also we bought at really reasonable rates. Maybe we put some hard money into that, but generally we've just used debt financing to pay for the deposits. And it's worked. I mean, I can't tell you, you have to look for the right building. I think we've learned where we can add value, where, we don't own a lot of properties considering how long we've been in this business, but we've made the right calls. Like, we've never bought a property with one exception, I'll add, and that was a vanity play, and I got burned on that, but that was because we bought a condo down in downtown, the Eastern Building, which is an iconic Art Deco building with this beautiful kind of turquoise tile on the outside. It has a clock. You've probably seen it if you've been in LA.
Right.
But we bought a condo in there thinking, oh, that would be great to have, and turns out it wasn't great at all. So a loss, but it wasn't a lot. It wasn't a big loss, but we learned our lesson. But other than that, you just have to be smart. You have to know your numbers. You have to know what kind of value you bring. You have to know what the rent potentials are. We have certain practices that we use to estimate what rents are. But now at this point, I've been all over it. I've been in every pocket of LA multiple times. I know what the renter profiles are, the demographics, etc. I know what kind of product we offer and how we can do better than the average person. And so that served us well over time. So, we branched out, we went into Koreatown, we've gone into East LA, into San Pedro, where else? Carthay, like I said, we have in Glendale. So we're spread all over the place, but the common thread is, we have to be able to go to our properties and see what's going on and get to know our tenants. And given the fact that we really pride ourselves on making all our properties pristine over time, our tenants really appreciate that. And I've never had an issue. We rarely have complaints ever. We've done so much that I think people know that they're not going to find a better place than ours, relatively speaking, in the local areas that they're in. Because
well, it sounds like you fix up these units to the point where you're not obviously at the low end of the market. You're at what kind of medium to high end of the market, and so you can.
Yeah, but we're not in areas that most people would consider A+ neighborhoods. Like, we're never going to be in Beverly Hills. We're never going to be in West Hollywood, Santa Monica, Venice, any of the coastal areas. We're going to be more in. We always focus on properties in areas that are gentrifying, that have a certain tenant profile. Like, I call it the flight of the hipster. Where's
yeah, right. I understand.
Like, as an example, when we had our first building in Koreatown, we had a vacancy. Somebody decided they were going to move, and I was asked, like, yeah, where are you ending up? And at that time, I hadn't been in every single pocket of LA, but they said City Terrace, and I'm like, City Terrace, like, I know that area because I've driven past it, but I'd never even remotely considered moving there. I'm like, why are you moving there from Koreatown? Like, it didn't make any sense to me. There's no commercial businesses there. It's all residential. It's not exactly considered an area that most people might consider safe, but hipsters seem to have. And the reason, what I found out was, it's adjacent to Boyle Heights and also the Arts District, which was incoming at that time. So that's where they were headed. They wanted to go into the next area that was blooming and artist community was developing. So, it's important that you pay attention to what's going on, and how things are changing. So at some point, I kind of put a pin in that, and then years later, we eventually bought into City Terrace. I went in that area. I'm like, wow, this is, we looked at Boyle Heights, but City Terrace just had a nicer vibe. It was more single family. It wasn't as dense in terms of parking. There were fewer multifamily properties. So we found one that was gorgeous. It was a beautiful Spanish, but, again, not in great shape, needed a ton of work. But we knew exactly what to do, and it worked out great. And, people, when they saw the kind of work we did, it was super easy to rent. Even to this day, I put a rental on in seconds. I get tons of response, because you're not going to find any building like what we have. You simply won't. I challenge anybody. I'm like, find something better. You're not. Because I know all the attention to detail I put into that building, in terms of the facades, in terms of all the little character details, the hardwood floors, just, every little detail matters, to the people I rent to. But you have to know what you're doing. And a lot of people just don't understand, it's a very time consuming business.
Well, it sounds like you're still in the market to buy if you find the next great property, right?
Yeah. I mean, we were kicking the tires on a deal down in West Adams area. Unfortunately, it didn't happen. It was going to be a phenomenal deal, but obviously, what's happened now is this. I don't have any illusions that I'm ever going to find a deal that I can steal anymore. I mean, like occasionally, we got lucky, and I took full advantage of that. And we did everything we could to get things under contract. But there are so many buyers out there now, and people who don't necessarily have the same strategy that we do, and that's fine. People are entitled to do whatever they want. But we found a deal that made sense. It just didn't work out. But at some point, it will find something. It's just a numbers game. But I'm patient. I don't need to buy anymore. I just I do it so that because I enjoy doing this. I always said to myself growing up, like I would love to just spend my time like restoring buildings. I have never taken on any money from any other investors, but I would be open to that if people are willing to entrust me. But I have a pretty good track record. But at the end of the day, I haven't worked out any business model yet that would make sense for me to do that. But there's always a first time for everything.
So do you ever like drive by a property and it's, obviously not for sale, but it's like, oh, this would be the perfect property to buy. Do you ever try and solicit those properties?
Yeah. But, let's just be honest. I mean, I get solicited all the time for my properties from brokers. And, what I found is most brokers don't know diddly squat about, let me answer your first question. The answer is yes. I'll drive by properties that are, obviously got major deferred maintenance and would be a great opportunity for me. And, I'll ask, I know various brokers and I'll have them call, on these properties and see if they can find anybody. But most often people are not willing to buy, it's like, I'm sure you're aware of this, but, you get direct mail solicitations, you get phone call solicitations. I get phone call solicitations on multiple numbers at the same time, and you can't stop it. So,
right.
To the point where everyone's trying to sell you. So part two of that question is the frustration is that most brokers or agents, especially on the 5+ unit multifamily side, they want to get you to believe that somehow by selling your property, they can transition you into another property that can generate more income and more.
Yeah.
And I'm like, and they always want to meet with you. And I understand, look, I get where people are at. I understand it's a tough business to be in, but I've gotten to the point where I'm not sitting down with anybody anymore. If you want to, do the work for me and present me with a ironclad, here's something on the market, here's the financials, here's how your equity can be leveraged into way more net operating income, blah, blah, blah. And it's very clearly laid out and, there's no activity on that property for some reason, and it's not going to be hard to get under contract at the right number. And you've kicked the tires, you've looked at all the due diligence and you've seen, you've questioned all their pro forma financials and whatever. Okay, fine. I'll sit down and listen to that. But nobody wants to do that work. They just want you to like
I understand. Yeah.
pointless, so it's like, it's really incumbent upon the buyers to understand the math and know it just by looking at the property, like just making certain basic assumptions. I built my own, real estate models that, that serve a lot of different purposes, from financing to operating income to leveraging cap rates and other metrics to figure out what the future value would be once I add my particular value, what kind of estimates for rehab costs are going to be, building that into the financing, et cetera. So I understand all the ins and outs of all of that. So when I see a deal, I can quickly just, change the variables in the model, and I can see whether it's going to meet my requirements from a return on investment standpoint. I have my certain rules of thumb. I'm not a big fan of cap rates and GRM because I feel like they are based on faulty assumptions a lot of times with the how properties are being operated. So you have to have your own metrics and you have to really be detailed. Otherwise, you're going to be in real trouble. Never go off any OM numbers that I see, because for people who don't know, OM is operating memorandum for it's basically the listing, with all its various details on the numbers and the location, et cetera. But you get those and you have to scrub those numbers. And you have to know, okay, what would I change? How would I affect these numbers? What do I know about how things are operated and how I can bring that to bear and make the appropriate changes of numbers so I can get to a number that makes the most sense for how this building is being operated. But, at the end of the day, if you don't do that, then, you're just not going to be successful. So you really have to train yourself in those numbers and know them inside and out. So when I talk to people, I can cut to the chase real fast. And yeah, I do get calls from time to time. Occasionally there'll be a deal, but I'll be honest with you, most of the deals, I would say, I can't think of one deal. I really can't think of one deal that I didn't find myself. And what's ironic about that is it was on the open market. These were deals that anybody could have bought, but they didn't see what I saw. And for whatever reason, they put an offer in, but they didn't know what they're doing. They got cold feet and they backed out. So I've been fortunate that way, but that's the way I do it. Like, I'm not going to be pressured into doing anything. I'm not into best and final nonsense where I have to go into a bidding war with people. It's like, I either have control of the deal or I don't, I don't think I've ever really been in a bidding war with anybody. I think I've made an offer. Maybe there might have been one additional buyer, but they dropped out for whatever reason, and I was able to get control of the deal when it made sense, of course. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, I definitely really enjoy what I do. It can be very frustrating. I mean, there's all kinds of changes now that are happening with legislation, with the insurance market. Just you have to be adaptable and nimble and always have, a safety net of capital, in the event that anything happens, because you just never know. And right now we're in a very uncertain time on so many different levels. I'm not just talking about tariffs. I'm talking about just legislation locally, statewide, federally. You have to really be on top of that. You have to know. You have to educate yourself a lot on all these new laws that are coming down that impact our ability to operate profitably, from balcony inspections to, renting. They're trying to change the laws on how long it'll take for you to serve a 3-day notice. Now you're talking about 14-day notices for people instead of 3 days.
Oh, wow.
There's so much legislation pending. Landlords have to be, they can no longer be complacent and just hope that some other entity is going to look to protect them. There are entities like apartment owners associations and so forth that do great work, and they're out there lobbying for, bettering things for landlords. But we're fighting an uphill battle, especially in LA, where we have a lot of very corrupt, unscrupulous council members that really, at the end of the day, are just looking to destroy business. They have, if you look at the backgrounds of these people, they live in, I understand why they're doing what they're doing. They live in neighborhoods that they represent that are perhaps, gentrifying or whatever. And I get it. And they feel threatened and they feel the need to, leverage their political power to, take it out on landlords who are literally just business operators like anybody else. And we have probably way more regulation on our industry than any other industry that I can even think of. I can't think of one industry that's more regulated than property owners. I mean, it's absurd. When you think about how many laws come down, we are always the scapegoats. We're always the bad guys because you hear these once in a while stories about a landlord that isn't doing what they should do, and then they blow that out of proportion, make it seem like every landlord's the same and we're all greedy. And it's like, I talk to people sometimes, you'll be on like Nextdoor and they'll say, they're angry with their landlord because he didn't do this and that. And I'm thinking to myself, you have no idea what you're talking about because you have no idea how expensive it is to operate property and how unprofitable it really can be when you look across how much we have to do. Case in point, here's an example, insurance, right? We have insurance that is now going through the roof because of all the fires. Insurance companies are trying to pull out of California because they feel like they, can't make any money and they're not able to get the premium increases that they're looking for. Well, now in order to save in order to even qualify for an extremely, increased premium, just to be fortunate enough to have insurance that is way higher of a premium than ever, they're requiring you to do all kinds of upgrades and improvements to your property just to qualify for a greater premium policy. So it's like, so you're getting hit on both ends. People don't understand that. They don't understand that, okay, well, tariffs are going to impact the cost of goods for all of our materials. It's, labor's not getting any cheaper. You want quality labor? Well, good luck now, because all the rebuilding that's going to happen in Palisades and Altadena, all these contractors are going to be making money hands over fists, and their rates are going to go up because, hey, if you need somebody, you better be paying up because you're not going to get anybody who's going to be worth their weight in gold to, maintain your property. So it's like people are, and that's just the beginning. What about increases in utility costs like water? Tenants don't, they never sit here and take responsibility for wasting water in your properties. They'll run the sink however long they want, right? There's nothing you can do about it, because try to sub-meter your water. It's next to impossible, So I think we get a bad rap. But at the end of the day, I knew what I was getting into. I'm a big boy. I believe in, doing things the right way. I think, I've managed my risk as well as I can. But at the end of the day, it's just getting harder. So, it'd be great if, people like me got more appreciation for all the work we do, because a lot of tenants act like as if we don't have a job. Like, this is not a job. I think that we're just literally
hardest job ever
collecting money. When in fact we have a ton of bills to pay, a lot of planning in terms of future rehab to do. We're subject to way more laws than we should be. And at the end of the day, we only get calls not to thank us for all we do, but to only complain when there's something not working, and they expect us to fix it immediately. And in exchange for that, we get basically looked at as pariahs in society. So, this is the business. So if you want to be in this business, you have to have a thick skin, and you have to, manage your risk as best as possible. But still, I believe in being ethical. I've never done anything. I've never tried to, get people out, of properties by pressuring them or any of that nonsense that people do, where they buy buildings and it's a calculation, like how many units can I vacate? I'll present offers to people and blah, blah, blah. I don't believe in that. It's just like, look, I buy a property. If it's making money as is the way it currently is, great. But I'm not going to sit here and base my financial model on, okay, I've got to kick a bunch of people out. And that's another reason why you get a lot of people who are upset with landlords, because they hear about the Ellis Act being misused, and they hear about, all these buyouts that are happening and people getting pressured. And, a lot of that is just blown way out of proportion. But, I'm not saying it doesn't exist, but I just think that, the reality of what's happening is very different than what it's made out to be. So.
Well, I think we could talk for another couple hours about the whole relationship, and maybe we'll come back to that next time we talk. But for now, where can people get a hold of you, Neal?
Well, my email is on there if anybody is interested in hearing more about my story, or, has questions. I'm more than happy to talk. I know it's a very tough business. I've been in it for 25 years. I've taught myself. I've learned a lot. I've made a lot of mistakes. But at the end of the day, I have a lot to share, and I'm always interested to hear, what other people who are going through the same journey have. And you never know where interests might cross. So, you have my contact. Also, my cell phone is, I can provide that, I guess. Is that correct?
Yeah. No, that's great.
You can always reach
if for the listeners out there, if you have a quality Spanish style apartment building in the LA vicinity, maybe Paul would be interested in talking to you about it.
Neal, not Paul, but yes.
I'm Neal.
It's
Sorry.
okay.
Sorry.
I'm always happy to listen. My cell phone is 818-653-6505. You can call or text me at that number. And happy to engage with whoever.
Well, very good. All right.
That's a wrap on today's journey through the SF commercial real estate scene. Ready to share your story? Visit sfcommercialconversations.com/guest. Your insights could lead the next conversation.